Hi, my name is Professor Satar. I will, in this recording, provide the basic concepts for present value and future value. This is per Professor Grimes' request, and I hope you find this helpful. Even though my focus for the students in the nonprofit management for Baypath, and again, a request from Professor Grime. Request was to have a brief overview of present value. I think, as some of you who know this concept know, it is very difficult to separate the future value with the present value because it is a continuum. And so, what I want to do is to start at a 40,000 feet, talk about this relationship between the future value and present value, and then give you some basic concepts on the present value. And if anybody wants to get deeper into this subject, please let Professor Grime know, and I would be happy to provide additional tutorials or additional material if you want to get more into the time value concept. So, first thing I want to do is to talk about what are some of the key elements that are in the continuum. As I mentioned, they're all related. The first one is this present value, which is really the focus of this presentation. But in order for me to get there, I think it is important that students understand the relationship between the present value, the future value. Obviously, the present and the future by default is connected by time. And typically what you're going to find, if you read any material about these relationships, they will say number of periods between the present value and the future value. And what do I mean by this? That means it could be number of years, could be number of months, could be number of weeks. So this basically becomes the period or the end for the continuum. So that's one. Future value is 2. Time or n is 3, and I mentioned there are 5 of them. The fourth one is the R, which is to say that if we are going to look at the relationship between money in the future versus money in the present, that will also depend upon how the rate of return is, or what the R is. So that's what the R is. And finally, the fifth piece is typically called PMT or called annuities. And so what I want to do is not to get too detailed into the continuum relationship. What I wanted to do is to at least have this conversation, so I think you can relate to the present value, when I get to it. So what does the continuum mean as far as those 5 things? Again, as I mentioned, we have a present value. With time, it will grow from here to here, which at some rate R. And number of how many periods it's going to grow will depend upon, typically when we're starting at the present value is considered as now, which is 0. Then if the periods are in, say, years, this would be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and so on. The fifth piece, which is the PMT, would mean is that what if there is some type of money associated with it on an annual basis? What does that mean? So let me give you a more practical example of how it relates to us in our daily lives. An example of this continuum would be is to say that what if I have $1,000 and I want to put it into someplace in 401k. I pick a mutual fund, and let's say historically that mutual fund is making some return, and obviously we don't know what the future will be, but we can only use from a research perspective only the history. So we will say, okay, it has grown at the rate R, so we put in a present value of $1,000. It is going to grow at rate, let's say, 5%. And the next question will be to say, okay, how far in the future do I want to go? Let's say we want to go down to, maybe, all the way down to, say, 20 years when we plan to retire. So now we will have an N of 20, okay? And the next thing will be is to say, okay, will I be putting in any additional money after putting in this $1,000 upfront? Let's say we want to put in some money. Let's say in a paycheck every month or every year, because we're talking in the in the annual in this case. Let's say we're gonna put another $500 every year. And so now we have present. We put in 1,000. Annuities, or the PMT, we're putting in 500 every year. We're putting it for 20 years, and we think it's going to grow at R. So based on that, the relationship, the continuum, we can figure out if we do put in 500 every year, and if our fund does grow on average 5% a year in 20 years, how much will I have in the future? So that is really why these are all connected. Okay, so think of it in terms of pictorially. The relationship between the present value and the future value, and if the only thing we are going to put in is a amount today and not put anything in between, and then want to know what it would look like in the future, the relationship between the present value and the future value is this formula. Basically what that means is, if I put in present value, then every period, whatever I have, okay, it will grow by some amount. That means I have to continuously grow. So I'm going to start from here. I'm going to grow by, let's say we're talking about R is 5%. So I'm going to grow this from here to here. So let's say if I put in $100, by the time I get here, it will become $100 plus 5% for the growth. It will become 105. Okay. So now I'm starting at 105 over here, and if I grow it another 5%, amount will grow. If I, then I get here, I grow another 5%. Eventually, I can get there. So rather than doing this thing one step at a time, especially if you have to do it for 20, 30 years, this formula basically allows you to do that. So we basically are taking the present value, $1,000, $100, and then we can say the formula is I'm going to take 1 plus whatever I'm assuming for the growth rate. Let's say if it is 5%. 5% would mean 0.05, and then I'll have to raise this to number of years, and let's say this will be 20. Okay, so that's the relationship between the future value and the present value. If I know the present value, if I know the N, if I know the R, I can figure out the future value. Okay, so obviously this relationship would also apply in the opposite way. In a sense, if I know the future value, and if I know the rate, and if I know the N, then I can basically do this too. And that's what this is right here. So basically this is right here, is that we can go in and flip this thing around, and now the present value will be, so the present value will be what my future value is there. And if I want to know the relationship between future value and present value, again, I would say 1.05, and I will raise it to 20. And if this is, let's say if I wanted to know that I'm going to get $1,000 in the future, what would be worth today? So I'm looking at the present value for the $1,000. So that would be $1,000 over 1.05 raised to 20. Okay, and that's how you do the present value. So let me continue with the future value a little bit more, and then I'm going to bring it back to the present value. So the future value, let's say we had money that we are putting in today, 2,000. Then a year from now we put in 3,000. A year from now we put in 4,000, and then in the last year we put in 5,000. So if I wanted to know all this stuff, how will it be in the future? Obviously we can go in and take this one, and because this is going to grow from here, so it would be 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. Obviously we will have to grow it by 3 years. This 2,000 has got only 2 years left, so N will be 2, and this one has got only 1 year left, and so on. And that's how you would figure out what the future value will be. Now, obviously all this stuff you would not be doing it with a calculator, you would do it with Excel, and I will touch on it very, very briefly later in this tutorial, is how would one use Excel, but at least I want you to understand conceptually, even if you use Excel, what is Excel doing it for you? Excel is doing these calculations for you. Okay, so if you had a situation where we had $1,000 putting it in, obviously we can go in and then go figure this thing out so we can know the future value. Okay, so now let's talk about how would we use in the Excel. And the way you would in Excel is if you go into Excel and you look in this over here, this is formulas, and then you go in financials, you will obviously, a bunch of things will open up. You're going to find, let's say if you're looking at the future value, you're going to find the formula that will say FV or future value. It will ask you for, hey, what do you want to put in for rate? And let's say if I was doing this example I was doing before, best thing would be is that I would create up the Excel file where I would say my R here is 0.05 and N is so on. I can plug it in and then I can just refer to the cells, or I can type the numbers in. So I would put in R here, how many periods we are talking. Are there any amounts that I'm putting it in, equal amounts putting it in every year? I would put that in. If I'm not, I'm just looking at from this point to that point and there is nothing else in between, then obviously I would just plug in 0 here, and then what am I starting out with? Let's say I'm starting out with $100. You'll put it in and then I hit return, will give you the answer. Okay, now the question is, again, Professor Grimer asked me to talk about the present value, and I'm talking about the future value. So what would you do if you had to do it for future value? You basically go in same place in the Excel, but this time around you're going to find something that says present value. Okay, and the difference will this box and that box will be is that in that case, because it is going to calculate the present value for you, instead of present value here, it will have future value. So if I want to know $1,000 in the future, what it is worth today, present, okay, and if I know the number of periods, let's say it is 5, and if I want to know what the R is, let's say it is 10%, okay, then in that case R will be 10%. So I would put in, again, when you put in a percent, you're not putting in a 10. Obviously, as you know, you would be putting in 0.10 because percent is, in cents, it would be like 10 cents out of a dollar, so it would be 10.1. Your N will be number of periods, so that will go over here. Present value, let's say, future value, which is $1,000, you're putting it in, will go in the box, which will say future value if this was a present value box you're looking at it. And then basically it will give you the present value, and that's obviously how you use Excel. So now from a concept perspective, what does the present value mean? I think we talked about future value. Again, the present value, like I said, is a continuum. So the opposite is happening. Here is a future value. I need to know what the present value is. Let's say the R is 10%, and obviously I have 3 years. So question is, as I mentioned before, that the continuum relationship is that the future value is related to present value by growth rate and the number of periods, right? That's what we talked about before. So obviously if I want to know this thing, then I would basically rearrange this thing, would be present value, would be future value, and again it would be 1 plus R raised to N. Now again, this is not a class for algebra, this is not something you will have to do, but I think it is important you understand the relationships here, so when you are doing the calculation, understand what is going on. So I have $100. I want to know the future value is, the present value. So basically, I would use the formula I just mentioned. I would take present value, so I need the future value, I divide it by 1 plus R raised to 3, and in this case, if the R is 10, N is 3, that's the number I would get. So what does that mean? What that means is, because we are way out in time, $100 in the future is going to be worth less today, and that will depend upon what our assumption is for R. And in this case, if R is 10, it should be 0.1 here. If R is 10, then we would get this relationship over here, okay? So again, in summary, again, if you want to use Excel, then what you will do is, again, go into formulas. You will go into the formulas, then financials. You can do a future value, or you can find present value, or you can find other things there, and from there you can calculate any one of them. Okay. Now, one of the useful things about this whole time value concept in our real lives is to say, okay, what if I was looking to refinance my mortgage? Okay. And so for trying to refinance a mortgage, obviously the question for us pops up is to say, let's say if I want to borrow $100,000, and let's say the mortgage rate is 5%, and let's say we're going to borrow it for any amount. Let's say we want to borrow it for 15 years or 30 years or whatever. What will it be monthly payments? Okay, so this is where these kinds of things will become very, very helpful, where in that case I would go to, again, in the financial formula and find something that will say PMT. Okay, and it will basically, in that case, what's going to happen is that PMT will not be there because it is asking me to solve for PMT. Instead, I'll have a present value, I'll have a future value. So again, these are the things that are helpful from a time value perspective. So I hope this was helpful. I will just, in the end, just summarize it for you, that the present value, the future value, the present value is linked to the future value. It is linked through time, and it is linked through the rate R. And if I want to know present value, I will look at the future value, and I would divide it by 1 plus my return and how far I am. Okay, you can do it mathematically. You can use it, using Excel. If you want to put this formula in Excel, you can do that. Basically, you would do is to put down whatever the future value is, and you're going to put an asterisk for multiplying it. You're going to open parentheses, 1 plus, let's say the R is 0.1. In order to do this n, the symbol you use is a little arrow thing like that. I think it is above the key 6. And then you're going to put in n, let's say it is 10. Okay, so that's how you would figure out this is how you figure out the future value. And if you want to know the present value, you basically would take present value, trying to solve it, you plug in the future value. This time you're going to divide it, because we have to divide it. Again, open parentheses, 1 plus whatever the R is, and again, little key symbol like that, and then you're going to put in the n right there. So hope this is helpful. If you need any more information, please Professor Grime know, and I would be happy to provide you with some examples, either through a little whiteboard conversation like this, or through any lectures that you may want me to cover. So